All right, we're live. What's up, everybody? My name is Sunny Ray. This is the Sunny Ray Show. Today, I'm with Zeeshan. Zeeshan, how's it going, man?
Hello, Sunny. Nice to be in your presence today.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me
likewise.
on.
Likewise. Yeah, I'm excited. Hey, Zeeshan, just to kick things off, I was gonna say, do you want to maybe tell people just like under a paragraph or like the elevator pitch, whatever? What is refi trading? I like to dive right into the deep end, and then we'll come back to that topic, obviously, later on in the interview. But just thought we'd start right there.
Yeah, sure. So, Refi Trading is a non-custodial AI trading infrastructure for people who want institutional grade execution without handing over control of their assets. So, users connect their broker, define their own risk limits, and deploy our reinforcement learning driven execution with their own boundaries. So, we use cryptographic proof gates and audit trails um, built right into the workflow so that we're designing from bottom up compliance. So the simple version is that we're basically Wall Street grade automation, but radically more accessible, with the user still being in control. And it's all operated with the latest and greatest in reinforcement learning technology.
Cool. Oh yeah, all areas that I'm personally super interested in and kind of
Yes.
geeking out on.
Yeah.
I find like the tech and the business money, all that stuff falls a bit flat if I don't know a bit more about the person. And
Mhm.
so yeah, a lot of my I don't know, my shows about just, the person, yeah. So I'm
Yeah,
excited because obviously we have similar backgrounds in terms of where we grew up. So
we sure
I'm
do.
excited to take a walk down memory lane. But so take me back to the beginning. Where did you grow up, and what was young Zeeshan actually into?
So I grew up in Edmonton, Canada, and from early on, I was really drawn to. I would say my first interest in business was in visual communications design. I was drawn to systems of design, really. I would say. So I liked understanding how things worked, how people behaved, how people reacted to things when they saw things, and I really was intrigued. I can, some of my earliest memories are looking up at billboards and wondering why, they were designed a certain way and why they had the messaging that they did. And, I was always curious about that. So even before, AI and crypto and all that entered the picture, I was always circling around the same themes of, technology, human behavior, and access.
So you spent over 2 decades across, financial systems, emerging tech, and human behavior. Can you like what was the your first, real job that shaped how you think today?
Well, I'm going to take you all the way back to when we used to deliver newspapers. So I think, I always come across entrepreneurs, and there's a common thread with people around our age, and that they all had newspaper delivery routes. And what was interesting was that with newspaper delivery routes was you'd have to, first of all, get up early morning so you were disciplined. Second of all, you had to go around and make sure that you collected the money, or you got these people under subscription so that they could send in the money. And third of all, you just had to be like reliable, on time, and you were delivering the news. So I can remember once I had my own little route wrapped up, I ended up actually subcontracting it to another kid in my neighborhood and going and getting an apartment block that took me less time. So I started to understand, business at its core, and how to scale business all the way back then. So, humble beginnings, but I started as a newspaper delivery guy.
And so you teach computer science,
Yes.
AI, blockchain, product strategy. What pulled you into teaching alongside building?
Sure. I mean, teaching keeps you really honest. When you teach engineers how to build stuff, you're forced to strip away the buzzwords and get down to really first principles. So I like building in market and then bringing those lessons into the classroom, because students um, they don't really need more abstraction. They need a way to reason about real systems, real incentives, and real failure points. I think when you take, the subjects that I do teach, for instance, AI-powered software development or product development for software engineers, they're really areas where I need to stay sharp in my own career. And so when you force yourself to, teach, you also force yourself to learn. So you keep a good framework of, what they call lifelong learning. Of course, also there's the aspect of legacy. The older you get, the more you realize that the next generation and investing in the next generation is what's important. And I happen to sit as an advisor on a number of my students' projects that started in my own classrooms and are turning into great opportunities that are growing themselves. So I think there's just a big opportunity in passing knowledge along to the next generation.
Fascinating. So how did you become both an NVIDIA and Anthropic certified instructor? Like, what does that unlock for how you teach?
So, I mean, nowadays it's really difficult to go to your classic sort of books and especially with the subjects that I'm teaching. You really have to go out there and get state of the art and understand how the industry is teaching its own, its own company, its own teams. So a lot of these companies that have intriguing technologies have certifications where you can learn how to teach, their technologies. So, taking AI seriously as a both technical discipline as well as a teaching discipline brought me to make sure that I was a certified instructor. The certification matters less to me as badges and more as a forced function. So coming back to the idea of lifelong learning, they push me to stay current and stay rigorous and translate frontier tools into something students and builders can actually use. So in the classroom, that means less magic, more method.
And before all this like crypto and AI stuff, what did you think you were going to be doing with your career?
Well, I always knew I would build, ever since, I was graduating, university and even during university, I was always sitting at that edge of understanding how, what was coming next and how I could, take that and turn that into an opportunity. Back in Edmonton, I started a company with 4 of my close buddies, and we were building websites back then, intranets, and we were doing it for NHL hockey players. We were building Edmonton Oilers, Detroit Red Wings, all the superstars back in the day, building websites for them. So we all were also doing corporate work for companies like TELUS, and we were working on the institutional level for University of Alberta. So that was always intriguing because I knew I could do the business side of things, but I realized how powerful and how valuable becoming a builder was. So, nose to the grindstone, and I learned how to code. I'm self-taught and, been building my own projects for the last 20 years.
And who were some of your early mentors or influences that shaped this kind of first principles approach?
Well, I mean, I can start with my dad. He was somebody that I always felt that he was so brave for coming to Canada from a country like Pakistan early on in 1967 and making it work. Him and my mother came over to Canada in like 1967, 68. There was hardly any immigrants, from Pakistan at the time. They were university students, and they went and started a restaurant. So, they made it work. And even though he was studying to be a geologist and getting his master's in geology, he was, learning about business. And, he actually ended up becoming a stockbroker. So he applied his knowledge about, natural resources and especially in Alberta. And he basically, back then there was a penny stocks, and he told people whether there was deposits of minerals in certain areas or not, and those would become business opportunities for people on the old Alberta Stock Exchange. So I was always intrigued. I used to go to his office, and I used to punch on the Bloomberg terminal, and that was like the first computer I ever used. So I think definitely my father was definitely a mentor of mine, and continues to be. Now he's obviously retired, and he's a wise Yoda-like man. And I just enjoy spending time with him, and learning why he took this huge step of coming from this country where they could barely keep the lights on, to Canada, and how he managed to make that work. So he remains very much a mentor for me.
And then looking at your career now, what part of your background do most people not see, but was actually the foundation?
Well, so people see AI, crypto, and they assume the story starts there, but of course it does not. The foundation is years spent around financial systems, product thinking, human behavior, and asking simple questions of why some systems create access while others create gatekeeping. So that is why I frame this work as infrastructure. I'm less interested in trends, and I'm more interested in access and participation.
It wasn't Harmon. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, we can take it back to there. I mean, Sunny, I mentioned to you on our last call that, during university, we used to throw, long weekend parties. Harmon actually came after us, but we, were in, before Facebook, before Instagram, we'd actually be, out in parking lots in Edmonton, braving the cold and putting flyers on people's cars for our upcoming parties. We used to bring the DJs of Snoop Dogg and Ludacris, and then get the DJs to broker the actual artists like Snoop Dogg and Ludacris to come to Edmonton. Then we used to sell those tours actually all through Western Canada. So yeah, that was definitely nose to the grindstone, learning a lot about business very quickly.
I bet.
I was keeping that a bit of a secret, but since you mentioned it, entertainment and media, of course, is really teaches you quickly about how people, human behaviors,
Right.
how people react to things.
Oh yeah, I bet. That's crazy that you were doing stuff like this so early.
Yeah.
So the story goes that an international wire transfer got stuck for 60 days and broke something in your head, right? So walk me through what actually happened.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I moved away from Edmonton at the age of 23. I moved from Edmonton I went to Dublin first, then to Melbourne, Australia for 6 years. Then from Melbourne, Australia, I moved to Dubai for a couple of years, and then on to New York City. And I actually spend a good chunk of time now in the country of Georgia, which is quite far away. So I always had this need to use different banking systems, global banking systems. And there came a point when I was sending a wire, and it was a wire from myself to myself. And all of a sudden, I noticed that it didn't come through on the other side, and so I started to look into it, and I realized, I'll name and shame Barclays, an intermediary that I had nothing to do with, started asking me questions about, obviously compliance questions about, where my source of income was and all of that kind of stuff, and that's fine because that makes sense. That's the banking system. But I realized very quickly that, why should we be dealing with this third-party intermediary when I'm trying to just send funds to myself? So I started to look into, the options that were out there, and I realized very quickly that, using, digital crypto systems were a really great way to, to be able to move money globally. And I just realized that, I started to look into things like Ethereum, and I started to realize that the entire banking system at some point will be run on this because it's trustless and it's very fast and it's very cheap. So I realized that even Barclays at some point will be using these systems, and if you look at international money, nowadays, a good chunk of it is run on these crypto systems, albeit private systems, but still digital systems.
And what did you try first to fix before you landed on, maybe the whole system is the problem?
Well, pretty early, once I looked past the noise, the breakthrough for me was seeing that the blockchain offered a new way to move value, verify state, reduce dependencies on intermediaries. So while a lot of people were looking at price action and how the cryptocurrencies were moving in terms of their own prices, I was looking at settlement, trust, coordination, global access, and really Rails as infrastructure. So that was the lens that I continue to use today.
Interesting. And when did you realize crypto wasn't about speculation for you, that it was in fact an infrastructure?
Well, I saw that durable value was always going to live lower in the stack. So hype burns off, infrastructure compounds. So if you build systems that help money move better, then you also help decisions get audited. You help access widen. You're building something that still matters even when the cycle changes. So when you look at companies like like Foundation, like Ethereum, or companies like Chainlink, these are this is the plumbing of the financial system, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And when the hype and the bull runs and they go away, and people pull out of the market, these things are still being used at an enterprise level because they create efficiencies and they create access, and and so I really truly believe in the infrastructure value of digital currencies.
And what was the moment? What was the moment that AI stopped being, a separate thing from finance and became the same thing?
So for me, that happened when it became obvious that finance is an information problem under uncertainty. So once AI got good enough to classify, optimize, route, adapt to live environments, it stopped being a side tool. It became part of the execution fabric itself. So at that point, the question was no longer, will AI touch finance? But the question was, who will build the trust layer around it?
Yeah, interesting. So I guess you talk about machine speed capital allocation. So when did that future become obvious to you?
So when I saw three things were maturing all at once. So better AI models, stronger automation, and cryptographic ways to verify behaviors before action. So once those three lines started converging, machine speed capital allocation stopped sounding theoretical, and it started looking like the next logical operating model.
I still don't follow. Machine speed capital?
Yeah. And so like when you think about the fact that you have, we're getting into a place where you have an agentic economy. These, it's all well and fine that they can transfer information. You can use OpenClaw to, do social media posts and that sort of thing. But what really happens when, these agents don't have a wallet? Well, they can't negotiate prices. They can't pay for services, right? So that's where you start to talk about, you start to talk about machine speed capital. So like instead of waiting for, an approval from a human being, the human being has already set a budget and a trace and, a route for a specific tasks that they need accomplished, and they leave it to the machine basically to make sure that that happens in the most efficient manner possible. So that's to me where we're going with this, is that it's the next logical operating model.
And what belief did you have about finance or crypto 5 years ago that you've since completely thrown out?
So I used to think better interfaces would solve more than they do. I don't really believe that anymore. I've seen Web3 come and go, and I think when you look at how much money Meta spent, for instance, on like Metaverse, and they even changed their name to that, then you start to realize that interface isn't what we're solving for. So in finance, trust has to be built into the architecture itself. So if the system is opaque, slow, and intermediary heavy, a clean interface only hides the problem. It doesn't solve it.
Interesting. So I guess let's just switch gears here. So give us the 60-second pitch for Refi Trading. Like, what is it and who is it for?
Sure. So Refi Trading it's a non-custodial AI infrastructure for people who want institutional grade execution without handing over control over their assets. So basically how it works is a user connects their broker, they define their risk limits, and they deploy a reinforcement learning agent to execute trades on their behalf. So the reinforcement learning agent is basically a set of 380 to 400 signals, dynamic signals that are processing to create a decision tree to essentially rebalance one's portfolio automatically. So we kind of have two sides to the business. One is, of course, as I mentioned, the reinforcement learning trade signals. And the other side is that we actually tie right into brokers without having to touch any client's money. So we're non-custodial. Now, on the broker side of things, we need to make sure that we are, create certain boundaries, quantitative and qualitative. So we use a quantitative boundary that is basically set by the customer, the user, based on their own risk limits. So we don't make trades if they're outside of somebody's risk limits. And then we have a qualitative boundary that basically watches for automated compliance. So things like sanction lists and money laundering lists and that sort of thing. So in a millisecond, we can figure out whether a trade is viable or not for that particular user, and whether we can execute that trade on their behalf on their broker terminal. So it's quite an interesting space because there's a new rule in the United States, and the SEC established a new rule, 203A, which enables companies like ours to basically have an end-to-end internet advisory that can generate trades for individual traders. So these are tools that have been locked behind closed doors for hedge funds previously. Hedge funds, they invest a lot of money in creating quant trading strategies. They don't hire traders anymore. They hire, quant programmers. So this is stuff that has not been accessible to your average retail trader, your wealth managers, even your family offices. They tend to not be able to invest the kind of money that hedge funds do. Now, the interesting dynamic on this is that hedge funds have managed to create extremely predictable income, whereas retail traders tend to trade with emotion and they tend to trade on instinct. And Sonny, if I asked you to find me a day trader on the Forbes list, you wouldn't be able to do that. But when you look at the hedge funds, of course, the people that run hedge funds are part of the 1% of wealth creation. So we're just trying to make these tools accessible to your average trader. We believe that is a great opportunity for disruption. Our model is built based on making those agents available. And so we sell those agents on a subscription basis, and we're able to sell also on a per transaction basis. So the more volume that grows, the bigger our company becomes.
So P402 is agentic payments infrastructure for the AI economy. What does that actually mean, and why does the AI economy need its own payment rails?
Well, so this comes back to solving a problem that you see right in front of you. And I teach AI, and part of my course, I have my students team up and build capstone projects. And what I was seeing with those students was that they were building projects using frontier models, so the most expensive models, and they were building stuff that works like a toy, works really great. But when it came time to scale, they hit a brick wall. Now, when you realize that there's a lot of people out there vibe coding nowadays that don't have the background of even a software engineer, you start to realize that people are not thinking about scalability and sustainability when it comes to token usage. So they're embedding frontier models into their software, and when they get the bill from OpenAI or Anthropic, they realize very quickly that they can't afford to keep their business running. So what P402 is it sits, I would say, one layer lower than what we're talking about Refi. It's the payment and routing infrastructure for AI native commerce. So it routes requests across 300 plus LLM models. It uses OpenAI compatible interface, and it settles with gasless USDC on base. So it gives every single request a trace. So cost, route, attribution, and settlement are all visible. That matters because the AI economy is heading towards machine-to-machine transactions at a high frequency, and subscription era payment rails are a really poor fit for that. If you think about, how much Stripe charges on a per transaction basis, well, you start with a 30-cent charge, and then on top of that, if you're paying for, say, tokens, you either have to bank tokens and buy a whole bunch at once with that 30-cent transaction fee. We're talking about a world where sub-penny API costs are very common, and if you're unable to meter that, then you're unable to optimize that cost. Just this week, Uber mentioned, I saw a headline that they had a token budget basically for LLMs that they used in 4 months. Their entire year budget they used in 4 months. So we're starting to see at an enterprise level that these enterprises need payment rails and budgeting rails and traceable budgeting rails for their LLM costs. So that's really what P402 does.
Interesting. So you call crypto an infrastructure layer for global finance. What does that look like in practice when it's fully built out?
Well, it looks boring in the best sense. Value moves faster. Settlement gets cleaner. Identity and compliance sit closer to the transaction. And most people gain access to tools that used to sit behind institutions. So the end state is not that everyone talks about crypto all day. The end state is that the infrastructure works so well that most people stop thinking about the rails underneath, and they actually have access to them. So you have people in the global South that can do the exact same things that the Western world and the global North can do, and have the exact same access. And so you give the same opportunities on a global basis, and you start to see that the wealth transfer becomes significant, and people that perhaps were living in squalor are able to start to take care of their families and grow wealth. So that's been happening for a very long time, and I really think that crypto as an infrastructure layer accelerates that.
What is autonomous finance and how close are we actually to it?
Autonomous finance is a shift from humans manually coordinating every single financial action to systems that sense, decide, verify, and execute within clear constraints. So we are not a full sort of autonomous in any kind of autonomous finance yet. We should not pretend we are, but pieces of it are already here. So AI driven decision support, automated execution, proof based controls, self custody's infrastructure. The real work now is stitching those pieces together in a trustworthy, or rather, you being a Bitcoin guy, knowing this word, trustless way.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how does AI change the way capital gets allocated, like for, let's say, a retail user and for an institution?
So for retail, I think AI compresses the distance between aspiration and capability. So, harping back on the conversation about refi, people who never had access to institutional tooling start getting closer to disciplined analysis, structured execution, better monitoring. So for institutions, AI shifts from being a research advantage to being an operational advantage. So faster classification, faster adaptation, better routing, tighter control loops. So in both cases, the real gain is not speed alone, it's better decision quality at scale.
Complex systems only work if people trust them. So how do
Mhm.
you simplify without losing the trust and the audit trail?
Well, you simplify the interface, not the truth. So the user should feel less friction. It's not about making prettier user interfaces. It's about making the user feel less friction. But the system should produce more evidence, not less. So that is the design philosophy behind both Refi and P402. Reduce cognitive load on the front end while increasing proof, attribution, traceability, and control underneath. That creates a system that is being built with compliance by design. So when you start to drop that into scenarios where, nowadays, you're seeing that countries are now requiring for sovereign clouds anything to do with fintech, right? So if you can build that right into the system, then you can enable that on a region by region basis and allow for a country to protect its citizens with their own rules.
So I guess help me land the plane. So 5 years out, if
Yeah.
Refi and P402 win, what changes for how capital actually moves in the world today?
So if both win, then finance becomes more programmable, more auditable, and more widely accessible. Refi helps move intelligence and execution closer together without forcing custody transfer. That's a big deal because post FTX, people do not want to send their money elsewhere, right? So they want to be in control of their own funds. Um, P402 helps payment and settlement become native to software and native to agents. So if you put that together, then the world moves from people operating clunky financial tools to intelligent systems handling more heavy lifting, while humans keep policy ownership and final authority. I do see a day where people that have uh, uh, nascent savings are able to take more risks. And it's, what stops them from taking risks now, Sunny, I believe, is that they're intimidated by the tools, right? So what we're trying to do is remove that friction and to create a system that creates positive benchmarks because it's just more efficient. So a good delivery pattern, is is basically establishing a situation where there's, coming back to the idea of less friction, but more trust.
Cool. So where do people learn more about both of these projects, and how do they tap into your consciousness? Are you writing on LinkedIn, or do you have a blog?
Yeah, so I mean, let's start with the first question. Refi.trading. If you search refi.trading, then that's the domain, refi.trading. And for P402, it's p402.io. I definitely publish materials on both of those websites as intelligence pieces to clarify not only the opportunity, but what the future holds, and what these intelligence systems can do for everybody from your common average people to your enterprise level businesses. So I'm also available on LinkedIn, and it's basically linkedin.com with my name, Zeeshan. And finally, it all comes together under the banner of nature of commerce. So I have a core philosophy and thesis that I'm building these businesses around, and that all sits under the umbrella of natureofcommerce.com. And people can reach out to me through natureofcommerce.com, and I'll be happy to have great conversations like we're having today.
Awesome. Well, Zeeshan, great, great interview. Really interesting. And as somebody who's spent 13 years in crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain, but then also almost as much time in robotics and AI, this is something that's really, really interesting and fascinating. And yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah. So
I mean, Sunny, you're leading the charge. When I saw your profile and understood that I'm speaking to a really intelligent person that sees the future. So happy to be having this conversation, and I hope we can have many more in the future, because I really respect outliers like you, and looking forward to engaging with you further.
Well, thank you, and thank Carmen. No, I'm kidding. We'll talk soon, bud.
Everybody's
Take care,
wondering who Harmon is.
Who Harmon is. Doesn't
Only
matter.
those who know really know.
I just find it so funny that you and I, we were at the same parties when we were in high school. So.
Oh, for sure. We definitely, ran into each other on the dance floor, for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all for tuning in, and for all the rest of the people who check us out in the future. Until next time. Cheers. Bye-bye.